So are the conventional pesticides and herbicides worse than the organic pesticides and herbicides, or I don't know?
I would say yes.
Okay.
Definitely. And it depends on the farmer's practice. So I've definitely gone to quite a bit of farms.
Welcome back to Making It Awkward. I'm Jessica Wilson, dietitian and author of It's Always Been Ours. You can find me on Instagram at jessicawilson.msrd. You can email the pod at makingitawkwardpod@gmail.com. You can watch video of this show on YouTube and Spotify. You can support the show by rating, subscribing, commenting, leaving an Apple Podcast review, joining the Patreon, and buying awkward merch like the shirt that I am wearing today. To be honest with all of you, this is my second time scripting and recording this intro. Today begins another at least two-parter episode. Most listeners know that for part one in a series that I like to remain relatively neutral and let listeners develop their own thoughts and questions for the follow-ups. But after listening back to this episode draft, it just didn't feel right to do that in a way that brushed up against something unethical for me. My interview today is with Dr. Theresa Lyons, founder and CEO of Navigating Autism, autism spelled AWETISM. She reached out to me sharing that as an Ivy League scientist and mom to a non-speaking autistic daughter, she's used her experience to guide other parents of autistic children in over 20 countries. Our conversation includes discussion about folinic acid, sleep, diet, Tylenol, and camel milk. Her initial email mentioned that the research shows that 37% of kids with autism can go on to lose their diagnosis and live without any additional support. This statistic was intriguing, and I wanted to know more, so we set this up. When going into conversations in which I think I may have a differing view of a guest, I don't do a deep dive into the research from my initial interview so that I can be genuinely curious and open with the guests. I want to make sure that we are not going back and forth on statistical interpretation and instead get to hear each other out. For my low-key preparation for this interview, I listened to Dr. Lyons' interview with Dr. Brian Lenskes on his Life's Best Medicine podcast. Theresa presented that 37% statistic to Dr. Lenskes, and he responded very positively.
Wow, and it's so amazing to have someone like you because, like, just to hear that 10%, right? Now you're saying 37% in some cases.
37%, not me. That's the research.
Yeah, that's the research. I mean, but to hear that, I've never heard that. This is the first time I've ever heard that it can be.
Wow.
And as a medical doctor who prides himself on knowing the latest research, I thought it striking that he didn't ask follow-up questions about that study. On this podcast and in society as a whole, we've seen how one study, one statistic, or one headline can transform a person, a news cycle, a movement, and then a political party. And I wondered how far that 37% would travel if thought to be a universal truth for all kids with autism. And I looked forward to asking follow-up questions in this interview. And still listening back, even though to me, the limitations that Theresa identified in this conversation would make it seem like we shouldn't be using that 37% as a hard fact, I also recognize that many people listening to this would not, especially parents like Theresa who are so dedicated to their children and getting answers. So at the top, I want people to know that even when someone can cite peer-reviewed research, it doesn't always mean they're representing it to its fullest extent and responsibly. Lastly, in my initial intro, I hadn't put the content note that I want to place here. This conversation includes ableist language and themes. Be sure to take care of yourselves. Dr. Theresa Lyons, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
A lot of folks will ask how I got different guests on the show. And for this one, I'm happy to say that you reached out.
I did.
How did you find me or the podcast?
I found you by searching different topics and looking for podcasts in which people were talking about real things and having real conversations. And that's why I reached out.
Interesting. Is it like a keyword search for you? Because I think I had just done the keto diet episode with Lexi, but I was searching for like out of the box thinking. So there was a lot of different, different search terms for sure. Fascinating. Okay, cool. Yeah, folks have asked me, and this is the first time I've been able to answer. So thank you for that. Yeah. So how did you come to your work?
So I had no intention whatsoever of working in the field of autism. That was not the plan whatsoever. I have a PhD in computational chemistry from Yale. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry, first in R&D and then as a strategist. So really understanding the business of pharma. How do physicians write their prescriptions? How are they educated? And all of that. And then I transitioned also into nonprofit work. So working with delivering medicines to developing countries, working with ministers of health. So I really enjoy healthcare. And then my daughter was diagnosed with autism when she was 3.5. And that just changed everything. It changed it basically took my life and just flipped it upside down, and no plans, no nothing. It was really just, okay, what now? And that's really how I got involved in autism.
Yeah. When you say life was turned upside down, is that with the diagnosis or things that were happening beforehand? Like, what did that look like for you?
It was probably like a year of my life that was just entirely flipped up and down and shook around. And I was talking to a friend the other day, and he said something about how, I was saying, certain things were just a little bumpy. And he's like, Theresa, I don't even know how you have that perspective, because you say certain things are just like mere annoyances, but they're like major life changes. So perspective and humor throughout this has definitely helped, but just my entire life, right? So, working for another company, the foods I ate, just the things I thought about, everything, what I thought my daughter was going to do in life, my emotions, right? So when you get that diagnosis, it was so heavy, and I was angry and frustrated and sad and just, grieving, all those negative emotions. That was what I was in for several months for sure. Yeah.
And you used your science background and started digging into all of the research?
Yep. So I would actually pop popcorn in the evenings, open up PubMed, right? That's where all the scientific journals are. I luckily still had credentials. So, a lot of these journal articles sometimes cost like $50 each article, right? So I still had credentials, so I could dive into all the different research. And that's what I did. I took that training, that academic training, the business training that I had, and just said, all right, I'm going to apply it to autism. I got to come up to speed. I've got to learn what is the cutting edge research, because I'm sure research to patient takes 20 to 30 years. And so I was not going to wait that amount of time for my daughter, right? Because if she's 5, then she'd be 35. And that's way too long to wait to take action on certain things. So it was really about, all right, let me come up to speed and just apply all those skills that I had and help my daughter.
Yeah. What were the things that you found first that you thought were the most compelling?
Oh my goodness, there were so many. So autism when my daughter was diagnosed, and so that's like 12 years ago now. It was said like, okay, autism, this is a lifelong diagnosis. Things don't get better. And in many ways, that's still the same information that is being delivered to parents today, 12 years later. And that's not scientifically accurate. So it is not for everybody. It is not a lifelong diagnosis. And so that was one of the first things that I found was these research publications. Over the decades, there'd be a few, and it would show that, a small percentage. When my daughter was diagnosed, it was about 10% of kids diagnosed with autism lose their diagnosis and go on to have a full life without needing supports. So no speech therapy, no OT, no PT, no, additional supports in school. And so that was just really mind-blowing and really important to have, because you make very different assumptions and expectations when okay, 10%, that's a decent number. And now over the years, the latest research in 2023 shows that that number is actually 37% now.
And to be clear, it's losing their diagnosis. There isn't necessarily like cure language in there, or is it both?
So scientifically, no, they don't use the word cure. So it's a great question. So in the beginning, it was called an optimal outcome, right? Mm-hmm. So that when a child lost their diagnosis, that was an optimal outcome. In 2023, that phrase has changed because the number is becoming so much more significant. That phrase has changed to non-pervasive autism.
Okay.
So that's really the language. And that's important for parents to know. Like you hear about autism and you think, okay, that's permanent, that's lifelong. And it's not. And that's not even the language that's used in the scientific literature.
With that, it's a subjective test, as you know, as I've heard you say multiple times. I'm wondering, with that 37%, is it like within a year, within 10 years, within 20 years? Like what is the research showing for that time frame?
So many times it's under 2 years.
Okay.
That's the time frame in the scientific literature. It can take longer and it can certainly take shorter. But in the scientific literature, that's about the ballpark. That's the time that they're measuring.
Intervals.
Yep.
Yeah. And is it the same for preschoolers as folks in their 20s?
So there's no research on that yet. I mean, there's so many fascinating questions to ask about, okay, how does one lose the autism diagnosis, right? So it's been, and science progresses slowly, right? So it's really, the research has been focusing on establishing that you can lose the autism diagnosis, that there is an optimal outcome, right? So that there is now what they're terming non-pervasive autism and non-persistent autism. And that is that first step. And then follow-on studies come with, okay, exactly how did it happen? And really starting to look at, is there a limit to one's age that would, impact any outcomes?
Mm-hmm. So, sorry, this was children. Was that what it was? Or
yeah, the research that was published, it's always children, usually under the age of 7.
Okay. Do you know how many folks were in that study?
There was several hundred. It was a large study. It was up in Massachusetts.
Okay. Got it. I will find that. When was it done? 2023? Is that what you just said?
2023 was the latest research published on this.
Okay. What interventions did that study entail?
So they were really asking the parents what they did. They weren't getting very granular in the sense of like vitamin D status or, mold status, or a lot of these root causes that cause some of the behaviors that are published in the scientific literature. There are different case studies showing different impacts when you resolve health issues. Then so much can change about behaviors and symptoms. And that's really where the research is going, where they're going to start to study, okay, how did this happen and systematize it? But the issue is it's different for each person. So there's so many different variables that can contribute to health issues that result in an autism diagnosis that putting together a study to say, okay, we're going to do X, Y, Z, you're not going to get that same impact because X, Y, Z doesn't work for everybody. Right. And that's been the issue with really understanding autism, and what helps it the most is just trying to do this blanket approach to, a group of people with autism and not understanding the underlying biology.
Sure. Back to that 37, it was interviewing parents. Yeah. What were the themes? What was happening for them?
So they didn't go into the specifics as to what they did. One of the main conclusion was that as the children got to be better and better, then the parents reduced the amount of, let's say, ABA therapy. So it's more that educational approach. So the intensity of, okay, let's, break everything down into stepwise. So as the child began to feel healthier and better, then the parents reduced that. And that was counter to what many people would think is what helped the situation. It's not, because right now with like insurance, the gold standard approach to autism is 40 hours of ABA therapy a week, right? And that's really intense. And it's also labor intensive. There's a shortage of ABA therapists. And that research specifically showed that as a child starts to get healthier and better, they don't need that intense therapy, so they straddle it down.
Okay. Yes, I'm leaning on your research experience here. So with that Massachusetts study and those 2 years, were the parents doing ABA, saw the results, and then on average of 2 years, they weren't doing it anymore? Or had they stopped at the beginning of those 2 years and were just able to like use that as a metric for not having a diagnosis in 2 years?
Well, they were doing a lot of different things like changing diet, giving different supplements.
Got it.
And it really was the endpoints that the researchers were measuring and then asking, okay, what is it that you did?
Got it.
So that's really the way the study was constructed. And yeah, it showed that as the child got healthier, then the parents reduced what most people nowadays would assume would be the whole reason for that child to get better. And that's not the case. So that was, such a difference to what most people were expecting.
Yeah. Do you think that's because the child learns to mask their autism and just learn that, say, it's less traumatic or less severe engagement with adults if they're masking their autism symptoms? Do you think that has anything to do with it?
Not in this case. Certainly not.
Okay.
Masking is certainly something that occurs. It's usually much older. So teenagers and young adults. And it's overall, the research of losing the diagnosis is not that kids just learn to mask. That's not right. So these are doctors who are observing the child, the parents observing the child, right? That's how autism is diagnosed.
Yeah.
So it's not as if these kids are somehow masking. That's not what the research shows whatsoever.
Okay. Obviously, autism is a spectrum. So, and I'm not sure how to phrase this. Maybe you can help me. And audience, please don't think I'm trying to pathologize people, but perhaps those closer already to being allistic. So maybe would that be like phase 1 autism? I'm not sure. I'll correct.
There's different levels.
Yes.
So like level 1 is the least.
Okay. So
needing support.
Great. So is that 37% like folks from level 1 to losing their diagnosis, or how many levels are there? Like, or is it level 4? I'm making this up. I'm sorry, people. Going to no diagnosis. What did you see there?
So there are 3 levels.
Okay.
So you have level 1, level 2, level 3. Level 1 is what used to be called Asperger's. So typically what that looks like is, someone can dress themselves and feed themselves, and maybe they could eventually live on their own, depending on executive functioning. Whereas level 3 is, the person, needs 24-hour support 7 days a week. There is no research that shows that level 3 can't move off the spectrum. And the research that was done in 2023, it didn't quantify different levels in that sense.
Got it. So it could have been level 1, level 3, who knows? It could have been all level 1. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
There was no nicely organized table saying there's none of that.
No graphs, no table. Okay. That's fine.
Nope.
I'll definitely look it up. I've heard you say that there are many different potential root causes for autism, and that struggling with health can result in an autism diagnosis. And I'm hoping you can say more about that.
Sure. So autism, the important thing to think about is the symptoms can fluctuate, right? So they can get worse and they can get better, right? So you want to stay on that track of how do things get better. There's published research that shows when a child doesn't get adequate sleep, then the autism symptoms themselves actually increase. So severity increases with a variety of things related to health. So that's why when you get an autism diagnosis, it's so important to understand, okay, what are the foundations of health? And is my child doing well in those different categories? So sleep obviously is one. That's where we detox. And there's so much important pruning that goes on for a developing brain for sleep. So if a child's not sleeping and they're not sleeping for, months and months and months, those problems are just going to continue to compound. So there's a variety of different things to do health-wise, just basics, right? This is not controversial. I'm not saying anything that is hugely controversial. And it's surprising to me, at least when I read these research where, and this was one of the original research that I read that got me excited about, oh, wait a second. Okay, my daughter, this doesn't have to be, something that just gets worse. This doesn't have to be something that is permanent, right? So if sleep and lack of sleep make things worse, could beneficial sleep, consistent beneficial sleep, make things better? And obviously the answer is yes. We all do much better when we have that nice quality sleep.
Yeah. So as you said, not controversial.
No. It's not controversial, right? But so research shows up to 80% of kids with autism at some point in their life struggle with sleep. And many struggle with sleep for years, right? And that's also when the parents, if you've ever seen an autism parent who's just like, oh my goodness, I haven't slept in like years. It's true. They're not being dramatic or anything like that. And those kinds of issues then compound a lot of things that a child might otherwise be able to compensate for.
Yeah. Do you think that's particular to kids with autism? Because I've heard parents with autistic kids say the same thing. Like, how do you see this different for different kiddos?
Well, with autism, there's usually something related health-wise as to what really is preventing that sleep. And many kids with autism will say or spell out that they want to sleep as well. So sometimes it's, we don't want to think that, oh, it's just a kid being bad and, oh, they're jumping on their bed, they're laughing. A lot of times if a kid wakes up in the middle of the night and starts just laughing and goofing around and they're up like it's, daytime and it's 3:00 in the morning, a lot of times it's a gut infection that is actually causing that, right? So there are all these different aspects to health. Vitamin D, super important. So if a child's having trouble falling asleep, that's really where you want to get a blood test. And I know blood test is not the favorite for everyone, but really understanding, okay, what is vitamin D? These really basic aspects to health that are so important, they can make a huge life difference. So parents I've worked with, sometimes all it is for sleep is they get vitamin D in the morning. And then the child's sleeping consistently and the parents are just amazed and so grateful. But it could be something so simple like that. So someone with an autism diagnosis should not be just written off and said, oh, they can't sleep. That's just autism. That's really not quality care for that person. So it's really important to work with either a doctor or just for the parents to trust their own intuition and really continue to seek out, okay, what could be a root issue for any of these problems?
Yeah, that sounds like something that parents, regardless of whether or not their kid is autistic or autistic, would, be a good practice.
Yeah. Most definitely. Vitamin D is important for everybody.
Right.
Parents too.
Oh, yeah. The grown-ups, for sure. So what about that gut infection is particular to kiddos with autism?
Well, the microbiome is in many ways different than a child without autism. Now, it can vary in a variety of different ways. So there's not one universal way for a person with autism. Their microbiome is different than someone who doesn't have autism. And that's the complexity, right? So it's always like, okay, so why is it different? And what is the reason, right? So some kids get antibiotics when they're younger. They have different ear infections and all of this. Some kids don't, right? But they still can have dysbiosis of the gut. It's really just understanding what are the root causes and then really addressing them.
Are you saying that kiddos with autism are more sensitive to these like gut infections, or they're more likely to get them? I'm not clear.
So you're asking, are they more likely to get gut infections?
Yes, than autistic kids.
So I don't know if there's any published research on like an increased risk for gut infections of kids with autism. I don't think I can quote any research on that.
Okay.
But when you have dysbiosis in general, then that opens the door to different opportunistic infections. But again, I don't think there's any published research on that.
Okay.
The research just hasn't gone that far enough.
Sure. So would that be one of the root causes that could lead to an autism diagnosis, or is that something that's happening in kiddos that are already diagnosed that you're seeing? I'm just trying to get root cause versus things that we're seeing. And yeah, I'm hoping you can help me out.
So when you say things that we're seeing, what do you mean by that?
Things that we're seeing in kiddos with autism, is that dysbiosis more prevalent? Are gut infections more prevalent? Or is this something that you're seeing that if treated with kiddos with autism, they'll have a different or better outcome than allistic kids? I'm just trying to get the connections between allistic kiddos, autistic kiddos, and how this all applies.
Gotcha. So I think it would be hard to tease out which came first, the gut infection or the autism diagnosis.
Yeah.
I think that would be very hard to tease out. It also would depend. A proper autism diagnosis can be given at 18 months now.
Okay.
So that is as early as it can be reliably given.
Mm-hmm.
The average age for an autism diagnosis is about 5, though. Right? So we have a huge gap as to when you can actually get a diagnosis and then take action. So some kids who are, getting diagnosed later, let's say 5 or 6 or 7, you might be seeing a large impact of that gut infection. Now, when that gut infection actually occurred, that would be really hard to tell. But teasing out that overlap, I think is very difficult. The one universal thing is that there is dysbiosis in the gut. And so then it really depends also on genetics and environment as to there's dysbiosis, but then what actually develops from that. It doesn't always necessarily have to be a gut infection, right? So if you have dysbiosis and let's say there's genetics that makes detoxing difficult, then mold could really be that main root cause for that child.
To develop an autism diagnosis.
So I don't want to say mold causes an autism diagnosis. Because it's not going to in every case. And that's where genetics also plays a role. So if someone is exposed to mold and their body can detox it, right, then they're not really going to feel that impact. It's not good long term, right? That's how you wear out your immune system. That's when you need a lot of vitamin D. You're going to need a lot of nutrients to really overcome that mold exposure, especially if it's chronic. But that's where genetics plays a role in all of this. So it's really hard to say, okay, this caused autism, right? So air pollution, right? This is another Harvard research study. Air pollution, the particle, the PM 2.5s, right? When pregnant women are exposed to that in their 3rd trimester at particular levels, not even necessarily hugely elevated, there's a 30% increase in the risk of autism. So that's where it gets, you can't really say air pollution causes autism, right? But it's one of those contributing factors. And so when a child is young, so under the age of 2, if they're exposed to a similar amount of PM 2.5, then their risk of developing autism increases to 60%.
Okay.
So it's a lot about risk. And then, right, so that's one category of risk, but there are so many other different risk factors that then that's how someone could have a really high elevated risk of autism.
There we go.
But you can't say it's causation.
Sure. Okay. So, and then if we go back and treat all of these things, either detox or, supplements and all these good things, then is that how folks will lose their diagnosis?
It's in part being very meticulous about health and understanding, okay, what are the issues for my child? Right. So that's when you use functional medicine, right? And you start with the basics of vitamin D. That's conventional medicine, right? So there's an interplay between conventional medicine and functional medicine, and you want to use both. It's not as if one is right and one is wrong.
Sure.
They just have different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
So I always advise parents to use both, right? You want to use all the tools that you have for your child. When you start to identify what the issues are, then that's when health improves. Usually sleep improves. Then curiosity improves, social interaction, right? So this is how you get a snowballing effect of the beneficial direction.
Yeah, I can see that for all kids.
Yes, definitely. Right. Yeah. And what I'm saying is not necessarily just for kids with autism, but for kids with autism, it's vitally important to understand what the health issues are. Because if you don't resolve them, then they don't go away. Right. So we can talk about leucovorin, certainly, if you would like.
Sure. Let's do it.
Okay, so with leucovorin, the reason why leucovorin is so pivotal is it can take a child who's not speaking and allow them to have expressive language. So then they're able to speak. The really cool thing that I want parents to understand is the children are learning all along, right? And the leucovorin just allowed them to communicate back. But they're listening all along. So for any parent who's listening to this and they might be questioning, my child's not smart and they're not understanding and they don't pay attention. They're learning and listening all along. It's just finding what those issues are that the body needs to overcome so that then they can start talking. So with leucovorin, typically what's done is the Frat test. So you have antibodies in the brain. There's a blood test that can measure if the antibodies are present. In 70% ballpark of kids with autism, they do have this antibody in their brain, right? So if this antibody isn't addressed, it's going to continue to stay there, right? So there's going to be that pervasive health issue all throughout their life. So that's why doing this test is so important. There have been 5 clinical research studies that have been done on this, small scale, so like 100 kids or less in different countries as well, not just in the US. And it shows that when you do the Frat test, if the Frat test comes back positive for these antibodies, leucovorin really makes a large difference in those kids. That's who it really will take a non-speaker and really have them open up and begin speaking more and more.
Okay, let's break this down for folks who aren't familiar with leucovorin Frat test. And let's make sure this is accessible to everyone here. So leucovorin, B9, folic acid or folic something else?
It's folinic.
Folinic acid.
It's folinic acid. Right. So it's prescription strength vitamin B9 that's presented to the body in a way where the body doesn't have to convert it or change it into anything. It's, easily used. So that's why leucovorin has been chosen in that sense. There's no name brand drug. So that's another aspect to the story, right? Like, why is it taking so long for this information to really get to the physicians? Is because there's no pharmaceutical industry out there educating the doctors as to, okay, write this script and then we'll make money, right? Because it's a generic drug. There's no company that is gonna make, millions and millions of dollars off this.
Got it. And then in the brain, can you talk about that test? Like why are people looking for antibodies and what's happening?
Sure. So the reason why you want to do the test is to see if your child has these antibodies. If they don't, then leucovorin isn't the right focus, right? And this is why we want parents to use different testing to identify what the health issue is. So you want to do the Frat test. That's the test that's done to measure if there are any of these antibodies. There is a spinal tap that can be done to actually, exactly. Not what anyone recommends, right? So a spinal tap could be done or a blood test. But those are the 2 ways to measure if there are these antibodies in the brain that are going to prohibit folate from being utilized in the brain. And folate is used a lot for speech, right? So that's the reason why everything kind of falls in line. If you have these antibodies, typically that child is struggling with some aspect of speech. And then when you provide enough folate, so by the leucovorin, the B9, you're basically just saturating the brain with B9 so that it can utilize as much as possible because the antibodies are still there. The leucovorin, vitamin B9, is not doing anything to decrease the amount of the antibodies. And that's certainly important to understand.
Super helpful. Thank you for, breaking all of that down. I'm sure that'll be very helpful for people. You mentioned the mold, heavy metals, and I know you've mentioned the detox and how important just sleep is for detox. What else do you find can increase risk for autism, either in diet or the environment?
There's so much. Those are the main categories. So I certainly want parents to focus on, those large areas because that's where you would start. You can get very sophisticated for, different mitochondria tests and get really granular, but many times that focus is too small and then you won't really see that change. It's really important for parents to do a test to see what the issue is, work on resolving it, do that test again, right? And see changes in their child. And then that's how you keep getting more and more granular. So you want to start in these large areas, things, like heavy metals, right? That's not disputed, right? Heavy metals is not something you want in your child, right? In conventional medicine, babies and toddlers get checked routinely for heavy metals, right? So and that's conventional medicine. For functional medicine, right, this is where the technicalities lie. So if you do a blood test for heavy metals, you're mainly going to see if there's been any exposure over the past 3 months.
Okay.
The body is really good in storing it, right? And that's what creates the problem for children who are exposed to, let's say, lead as opposed to adults who are exposed to lead. Like, why is it such a focus for kids and not adults? The reason why is because in kids, their body is growing. So calcium and lead are very similar on molecular size. And so if a child is exposed to lead, then they're actually incorporating that into their growing body. This is why it's so important when a child is growing to give them as good of an environment as possible. And so when the body gets exposed to different heavy metals, it doesn't leave it circulating. So that's why doing a urine test, hair tests typically aren't all that reliable because that is one of the ways that the body typically gets rid of heavy metals. So if there's heavy metal in the hair, it's not necessarily a surprise in some ways. So there's different nuances in doing these different tests. But the reason is so that you can identify what these main issues are in health and resolve them.
Yeah. So, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you all offer lab tests, and are those more the functional medicine or traditional medicine, or both?
Well, so on our Navigating Autism platform, we help parents navigate all of this information, right? You can see how complex it gets so quickly. And especially if you're not having sleep, then this is very, very difficult. Trust me, because I went through it. So we have a Navigating Autism platform where we organize the science into different categories and you approach it stepwise. And so parents can order the different functional medicine tests through the platform. The platform teaches them what the results actually mean. They also get to work with a board certified health coach so that they can really have the stamina to continue this whole process. We teach parents how to find a really good doctor because you need a team. You need a healthcare team. There's not just going to be one doctor that kind of just fixes everything. This is a healthcare journey. So you really want to have as many people rooting for you as possible.
That's nice. Yeah. So I get these lab tests and then I work with the coach. But even if I didn't have a doctor working with me with these lab tests, like that would still be helpful and okay for me to work with.
Well, it's helpful to orient parents in the right directions.
Yeah.
They might be working with a doctor who is not knowledgeable in the issues for their particular child. And it's important to know that. Otherwise, you waste time working with a doctor who's like, ooh, let's focus on this. And you do a test and you're like, oh no, this, this test came back fine. This is really where we need to focus. So that's why you want to use science to guide you. And then you add to the team based upon what the child needs, not the other way around. Otherwise you waste time and money for sure.
Yeah. You mentioned the environment, and I've heard you talk about organic foods, and I believe that you had said that organic foods are better for folks with autism.
Well, yeah, it's about giving less burden on the immune system. So if a child is struggling with different aspects of health, regardless of whether it's related to detox or not, there's different sources for inflammation, right? Even if it's just the Frat, that just these antibodies that are in the brain, you wouldn't want to put more burden on that body, right? So going organic and having as clean of environment as possible without going crazy is important to do, so that you're not putting additional stress on the body, because then you end up having to work really hard to compensate for, let's say, something they're eating, and that's not a good way to go about it.
Yeah. So are the conventional pesticides and herbicides worse than the organic pesticides and herbicides, or I don't know.
I would say yes.
Okay.
Definitely. And it depends on the farmer's practice. So I've definitely gone to quite a bit of farms. I don't farm myself. I'm a city girl, but I definitely started going out on the farms when this all happened with my daughter. I started getting to know the farmers who raise the meat. How are the meat raised, and go seeing the cows get milked, and organic milk, and the difference in color, and just there's difference in composition of organic eggs versus conventional eggs. So there's all of that contributes to just not putting that additional burden of all of those stressors on someone's body, autism or not. So that's really why organic is important.
Yeah. You brought up milk. I want the people to hear about camel milk.
Camel milk. Yes. So there is published research looking at, it was a clinical study, and they were looking at kids who were given camel milk, kids that were given cow's milk, both pasteurized and unpasteurized. So you had the camel milk wasn't pasteurized. And then what was amazing is these kids then did blood tests to actually measure inflammation, right? So the only variable that parents were changing was the milk that was given. And so the study shows that when the kids were consuming the camel milk, inflammation actually decreased. Whereas for both cow's milk, the pasteurized and unpasteurized, inflammation increased.
Got it. From baseline. So there was like no milk at all. And then it was inflammation increased with cow milk and inflammation decreased with camel milk.
Camel milk, yeah. Now, camel milk is expensive, right? So I'm certainly not saying that, let's go out and spend lots of money on camel milk. But there's so many different ways to decrease inflammation, just like there's so many ways to increase inflammation. So if a child has autism, and let's say they have, Frat positive, one of the things that many doctors say is stop dairy. And the reason why is because it is so inflammatory that is contributing to the reason why the immune system is starting to attack its own body. So that's something that's really important to think about and say, okay, is there anything in my child's life that is actually making things more difficult? Right. So sometimes people eat foods and then you notice behaviors afterwards. I had a parent who worked with us. Every time their child ate tomatoes for dinner, they did not sleep at night. Right. So it's like, okay, that makes sense. Nightshades, tomatoes, inflammatory. The inflammatory response then inhibits sleep. Right. So for them, they stopped the tomatoes and they worked on different gut health and things like that. But that's how you want to look at things and not make things more difficult.
Sure. Have you tasted camel milk?
I have not tasted camel milk. I have eaten camel when I was in Africa. Yeah. I ate camel, and the joke is, I learned this joke when I was there. The camel kicked me back.
Got it. So it's a strong flavor?
I liked it.
You liked it?
I liked the camel, yeah. I didn't like it the next morning and later that night.
Oh, is that what it refers to?
It kicks you back in the stomach. Camels kick a lot, and so it kicked me in the stomach, and yeah, it was very unpleasant. But sometimes it happens with camel meat. So
interesting. So, the meat versus the milk. Now I need to know more.
No, I ate the meat. I just ate the meat. It was on the menu, so
totally.
I was eating meat, but it kicked me back. So be careful.
Fascinating. Okay. One of the things that struck me when you emailed me is you mentioned the ketogenic diet. Mm-hmm. And I would love to hear, I've heard you talk about carnivore and ketogenic diet and autism. And I would love to hear the research on that.
Sure. So the ketogenic diet many times is actually recommended by conventional doctors for kids with autism when epilepsy is an issue. So epilepsy is a common co-occurring condition with autism. And so that's a lot of times where it has started, where maybe a parent decides to go keto. A lot of times a strict keto is related to epilepsy. And sometimes, epilepsy is very hard to control with medications. And again, this is where you have that dance between conventional medicine and functional medicine. And the ketogenic diet was actually started at the Mayo Clinic over 100 years ago, right? So it's so interesting to watch these things like cross over back and forth. But with the ketogenic diet, so sometimes it's specific to epilepsy, but with diet changes and when you have dysbiosis and different gut infections, carbohydrates sometimes are just really problematic for kids. So while different infections are being treated, a lot of times parents say, you know what, we're just going to do meat and vegetables and keep that keto because when my child eats pretzels, right, and they see some behavior come about. And so a lot of times it's really based upon observations as to, that's really problematic. So let's limit the carbs. So going keto is definitely something that is commonly done. But again, you want to have a strategy to it. You don't want to just do all that effort if it's not something that is really going to be beneficial for the child.
Yeah, because it is a lot of effort.
It is a lot of effort, yes.
A lot, yeah. And so the carbohydrates being generally a problem for kids, is that kids with autism? Is that kids overall?
So definitely kids with autism can be problematic for sure, just based upon the different gut infections that could be a possibility. So usually parents understand it's a problem because their child either is like addicted to that food. There are kids who are like, oh, I've got to eat bread. I've got to eat bread all the time, right? When you see that craving, regardless of autism or not, that's usually tip off that someone's biology and chemistry is really dependent upon something. And you can start to then ask why. So there are different gut infections that actually cause cravings. And that's what feeds the gut infections. So many times going keto just eliminates that fuel source for some of these gut infections. And then it makes being able to treat the infection a lot easier because you're not feeding it at the same time.
Got it. What are some treatments for gut infections?
Well, there's prescription. So it all depends. So this is why you want to do functional medicine testing. You want to understand. So different gut infections have different treatments. You also have the severity of the infection. So some infections are so high that, you need pharmaceuticals, right? No question. But others, a pharmaceutical might be too aggressive, might be too hard on the liver, right? If someone is dealing with toxicity, but then they also have a gut infection, you want to make sure you're not too aggressive in the approach. So doing these different functional medicine tests allow parents to put a number on it and then say, all right, how aggressive do we need to be without being over aggressive, right? So you don't ever want to do something that could harm your child. So that's why doing these different kinds of tests is really important so that the appropriate aggressiveness is done. Because conversely, if you're too weak, if you put it too weak of an approach, then it never gets treated. And then you're wasting all this time just going in circles.
Sure. Yeah. What do you think the top like 3 gut infections are for that you've seen either in your clinical practice or you've seen in the literature?
The top 3, I think that would be hard to say. There are certain common ones like Candida
Okay.
is certainly a common gut infection,
Uh-huh.
but not every child has it. So it's really important to get specific and do the testing so that you can isolate what is important for that child.
Yeah. And your labs, do you offer the Candida testing, or is that something that folks have to go to like their Western traditional medicine?
No. So the Navigating Autism platform, the different functional medicine tests, parents can order. Yep.
From there.
Just click, they order, and it gets delivered to their house. Very easy.
Cool. Oh, they don't have to show up somewhere.
Nope. No. FedEx and UPS is great. To the house, and then you just drop it back off, or you can even schedule a pickup. So
I'm with you.
Yes.
Is that just for the Candida test, or is that for all labs?
No, that's for all the labs that are on the on the autism platform. Yep.
Yeah. How do you maintain like the ones that need to be cold or solid or still, or I don't know? Wow.
So these are through different functional medicine companies. So they ship the entire kit. So if it needs to be frozen, there's an ice pack in there. The parents just put the ice pack in the freezer.
Yeah.
Some tests you have to actually freeze the urine, so you collect it. You put it in the freezer. Then ship it out frozen. There's definitely a variety of ways, but you want this to be as easy as possible for the parents. So it gets delivered to the house, and then you just drop it off.
This is fascinating. I love this. What were your thoughts or feedback that you've seen on RFK's Tylenol acetaminophen announcement? I think Texas this morning I saw an alert is suing Tylenol for causing autism.
Yeah. So when I listened to that whole announcement, I was very excited for the leucovorin piece, right? So the leucovorin piece is important because it impacts 70% of kids with autism. Okay. And you can be very rigorous about it, right? You do the Frat test, you get the results, and then you make decisions from there. It's very cut and dry. The only thing, some doctors are giving pushback on that because there hasn't been these large clinical studies, right? So there have been 5 small clinical studies around the world. Usually the next step would be, okay, let's do a clinical trial with 500 kids or 1,000 kids and have it be multi-site. So that aspect was skipped. But again, we talked about how it takes 20 to 30 years. So that part was skipped. And the downside of leucovorin, B9, is very, very minimal. So a child can become hyperactive if they have too much of it. Okay. And basically you pee it out the next morning. So there's not any, long-term harm or anything along those lines. With acetaminophen, the science isn't so black and white, right? So it's really hard to comment one way or the other as to, what should a mom do if she's pregnant and she gets a fever? There are sometimes those situations where you're just trying to make the best of the situation, right? So an extended long-term fever is not beneficial for the child, right? We all know that. There's no controversy around that. Taking excessive amounts of acetaminophen or excessive amounts of anything is usually not beneficial, right? And so the acetaminophen issue really relates to depleting glutathione, which is our body's way of detoxing. So there's different ways you could manage a fever while also making sure your glutathione doesn't dip. So it's really just important for the mom to think about the whole situation of maintaining that pregnancy, not having a long-term fever, but addressing it when it needs to be. So having that conversation and the impact of glutathione levels, right? Because that's the main scientific point of that warning of acetaminophen. It's important to think about regardless, right? So that might be something that a woman starts to think about even before getting pregnant. Hey, how's how's my body? Do I have enough glutathione? So I think that announcement was good in the sense that it got the conversation going, but there's not clear cut science in acetaminophen like there is in leucovorin and the Frat test. So that's why it gets so controversial quickly.
Yeah. What other ways are there to manage a fever in pregnancy? I've never been pregnant or been interested, so I don't know these things.
It would definitely depend on any other conditions, the age of the mom, where they are in the actual pregnancy. So there are many options, but it would be something to speak with their healthcare provider because it's very specific to gestation and other health issues as well.
Sure. I would love to hear more about the ideas of empowerment versus compliance for autistic kiddos.
Certainly. So the important thing to understand is kids with autism are learning from the beginning. So even if it looks like they're not listening or paying attention and they can't sit still or, they're getting irritable over certain things, they are learning. And I can say that so confidently because I've worked with so many parents who we've started out just life is chaos, kind of like my life. It was upside down and shooken around and things like that. And then as you resolve the different health issues, then it's a beautiful process when the parent starts to say, oh my gosh, how did she learn that? How did she know that? Where did he get that from? Right. And it might have been then the child starts talking about a trip that they took a few years ago when the parents thought, oh, this child doesn't understand anything what's going on. So it's really important for parents to hear that because you're not going to hear that in like a Facebook group. You're not going to hear that from doctors in the sense that your child is learning all along. So the more you can teach them about being empowered all throughout. So like the regular lessons that a parent might have thought, oh, I can't wait to teach my child about, having a strong character or making their bed every morning or, like certain aspects to that. That's all empowerment. It's really important that parents still continue to do that while working on their health because then they'll get to a point and then their child will be able to actually express all that they've learned. So empowerment is really important. Compliance just breaks someone's spirit. And that's why a lot of people don't like ABA because it's so repetitive. But in some aspects, it teaches a great job of, how do you put on your coat or multiplication, right? There's certain aspects where ABA and repetition is important. But you don't want to use ABA as like a parenting style. So you certainly want to continue to empower.
Yeah. Yeah. So did you look at your daughter's autism diagnosis as like a problem to be solved or was it what was the framing for you when you were going through all of this?
Sure. So I actually asked my daughter. So I was doing the research and, there were, especially back then, people would say, oh, an autism person, that's just the way they are. That's who they are. And you've got to just let them be. And I was torn. It was like, do I resolve these health issues and change who you are? Is this who you are? Like who are you and what is it that I should do? Right? I was a first time parent and I still only have one daughter. Right? So what I did was she was in her high chair and she was it's around the time of her diagnosis, so around 3.5 or so. Okay. And, not speaking, not pointing, there was not much happiness going on. And so she was in the high chair and I pulled out this big piece of paper, and I put it on the tabletop there. And then I took finger paints and I just put drops of paint on that paper. And I said, if this is who you are, I can accept you. I love you regardless. But if you want me to help you, if you want me to do something, then you've got to tell me. And so she took her hand and made some motions. And I'll send you the picture. She made a heart. Aww. So that was my North Star. That told me my daughter wants to feel better. My daughter wants me to figure out what different issues were, not change who she was.
Sure.
And not, somehow make her feel like she's wrong. She's not. But she clearly gave me love and was like, no, let's do this. And that was my guiding star. So.
Wow. Yeah, that's really powerful.
Actually, if you watch any of my YouTube videos, I have many in which there's in the back, there's a heart, and that's actually a big blown up version of what my daughter made, and it literally is my North Star. So it hangs wherever I live. That's hanging above the mantle, and it's just to remind me that my daughter wants to live a full life. She doesn't want health to prohibit her in any way, and that I love her, and she knows that she's loved.
Yeah. And then, it gives you purpose to share what you've learned with other folks as well.
Yep. Yeah. I learned a lot of science. So I love teaching. And that's the whole premise for the YouTube channel.
Yeah. What did I not ask about today, either about you, your work, or about your organization?
The only thing I don't think we discussed was that the Navigating Autism platform does accept flexible spending. So we try and make this as easy as possible. And it's a low $98 per month fee. And the ordering of the tests, parents pay for that additionally, because parents can order tests for other kids and themselves. And usually one family member starts getting healthy, then they start saying, hey, wait a second.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you mentioned AI, and I want to know if you're able to share how AI can be involved in this. I'm obsessed with AI in health right now.
There's a lot of aspects with AI and autism, and I don't have a simple answer to that question yet, but we're working on it for sure.
Wow. Yeah, I definitely come back when you please and tell me all about it when you get that started and the things that you found. I'm always looking for apps that can be supportive to folks, so that would be great.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yes. Theresa, thank you so much for your time today. This has given me so much to talk about. I'm sure we're going to have follow-up episodes about this. So, yes, thank you for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. As you all heard during the intro, this conversation will have at least one follow-up episode to explore the research presented today, including that on camel milk. I've invited someone to the show to talk about the methodologies and limitations for autism research, what's missed, and what it means that many of us are looking for solutions to situations that may not be problems at all. I'll link to some of the studies mentioned today in the show notes. And lastly, Dr. Lyons has offered to come back to the show to answer any questions submitted by listeners. There are a couple of follow-ups in the work, and I'll be back with them soon. Until next time, friends, drink some camel milk and make it awkward. You've been listening to Making It Awkward. I'm your host, Jessica Wilson. You can listen to this podcast on all platforms, watch it on YouTube and Spotify. You can email the show at makingitawkwardpod@gmail.com. You can find awkward merch on my website. You can support the show by joining the Patreon. This podcast is edited by Jen Jacobs, who will never try camel meat. The show is supported by the old guy who is the legacy, of Sacramento Outboard Services.